What's up, traders? Anthony Crudele here, and welcome to this week's episode of Develop Your Edge. In today's show, I'm going to talk about dealing with periods of stagnation and periods where we just don't execute that well. I'm actually coming out of one of those periods myself right now. But before we get into that, let me take you to this week's Ninja Trader Charting Edge. All right, traders, pulled up Ethereum here on the daily. Same old, 20 period, 3 standard deviation Bollinger Band. Red is the 10-day moving average, and that gold is just the middle Bollinger Band 20-period moving average. Brought ETH back up on the charts because I talked about this a week ago, and this is important. I want to take you back a little bit to what I talked about just the past week. I said I got stopped out of my position. I talked about that right here. Lo and behold, pretty much near the lows. I said we're going to be in a period of bearishness or consolidation. Well, that didn't last very long. And brings me to what we're looking at this week is back above the 10-day moving average. I like that. Starting to see, what do I say every time? Bollinger Band starting to come back in and starting to revert back in. What's interesting about this look versus prior looks that we've seen in Ethereum is if you go back and look, consolidation, open up, Bollinger Bands taking out previous peak highs or lows. Consolidation, higher high, right? Starting to open up. Bollinger Bands, obviously this is a massive one. Huge run here in ETH, taking out previous peaks in the Bollinger Bands. Now we're actually seeing this big Bollinger Band come back in, and when it's starting to close back in, we're actually inside of another Bollinger Band. And I want to talk about that because that's important, because what does that tell me? What did I say last week? Environment, environment, environment. Now, back into a full position, not quite a full position yet in ETH, but I'm actually using futures a little bit for this one as well. Back above the 10-day moving average, closing in the Bollinger Bands. I like that. I had to wait to see the close back above it. Started to get back in using some futures this time and not just spot. And the big reason is why? Environment. Bollinger Bands are now tighter. Now it tells me that I probably think we're probably caught right in here in this range. Could they break out eventually? Sure, they could. But for right now, I think the upside is going to be minimal. You got 2330s, the 20-day. I like that area possibly to see for a potential target. I'll watch that closely. And then up top, just looking at this old range, 28, 2900-ish area, I think we're going to be boxed in. I always say Bollinger Bands, when they start to come back in, it boxes us in. We didn't get an expansion of Bollinger Bands. Another thing I want to mention, why I like this trade right now, 1974 is a 10-day moving average. Just draw a line all the way across and look at 1974. I like to do that sometimes and say, okay, here's the 10-day. That's not only the 10-day moving average, but if you go back and look, that's pretty good support, which was old resistance. This area, I don't want to say line in the sand, but for me, I like this area to hold. If it continues to hold, I'll continue to grow my position, futures and spot, but I think the upside is somewhat minimal. I mean, it's still volatile compared to any other market, but I think that's what we're looking at right now in ETH, and that's this week's Ninja Trader Charting Edge. Now, let me bring you to a tweet I put out the other day. Got a great question. Sometimes we lose ourselves in the weeds and we lose our rhythm. To get that rhythm back, I get flat and lean on my favorite setup just to get that rhythm and flow of execution back. Dario asked a fantastic question. I think that makes complete sense, but to be more specific, how do you manage to achieve exactly that? For example, get flat and lean on my favorite setup. I tend to go back and review the first trading setup, then past executions and review mistakes. I try to focus on one setup. He's talking about what he does. Well, this is a great question with a very simple answer. And I love how you said that you go back and review the first trading setup, then past executions. I do that. I know many traders do that. That's a big part of journaling and figuring out what your favorite trade setup is. I've already established that. I know what my favorite trade setup is. So when I get into a funk, right, and I'm actually going to pull up the Ethereum chart here in a moment to talk about how I traded it not so well. It's so important to know that once I get out of a period where I was actually doing really well, then I got in a funk where I'm just trading, bought near the highs, sold near the lows, and I'm looking at it going, I'm just making a mess of this right now. Just wait for that favorite setup. But you have to know what that favorite setup is going in. I'm not creating a new setup or looking for something. That's really kind of the point of this tweet is that I've already done the work. So how do I go achieve that is I've already achieved what that setup is. You have to know that. I call it really my money setup. What is my money setup? Now let me pull Ethereum back up. And this is really what I would consider my favorite, my money setup. And I've talked about this so much on the show. Go back and look at all these videos I've done, a lot on ETH. It's been my primary market to trade for some period of time now. And just a little bit of backtrack here. I talked about ETH here when the Bollinger Bands came in and we were holding above the 10-day moving average, got really aggressive long on that. I talked about how I started to get stopped out there, then reestablished recently longs when the Bollinger Band started to come back in, going over my favorite setup here, Dario and everybody else, started to get back long in here, got really aggressive there, probably more aggressive than I should have, just because it was a little cluttered, still in the middle of a range, and all of a sudden I got stopped out near the lows. And that's kind of where that tweet was generated from, looking, going, I pretty much bought my last ads were right up there. And then when they started to come back down, I sold it on this bar right before here. Now, I could have easily said, look at this low didn't get taken out right here. And I think that's a big trigger as to why we popped. But I could have stepped back in there. But I looked at it and said, and that's kind of like I said where this tweet generated from, and said, I got to wait for my favorite setup again. It took every bone in my body not to buy them back pretty much where I sold them. Now I'm buying them higher, which everybody knows that's done swing positions. It sucks for that. It happens when you sell something, all of a sudden it reestablishes right away and you have to get back in. It's mentally difficult to deal with, but I waited for my favorite setup. I know what I'm looking for. Now, this one may or may not work, who knows, but I could have bought there. You could always do something. But I didn't. I had to wait for it. So I was actually tweeting, saying to myself, Anthony, you know what your favorite setup is. Going back to the question that Dario asked. How do you exactly do that? Is you know it going in. I'm going to talk to all of you traders right now and say, if you don't have your favorite setup, then I don't even really know how you trade. I look at it and say that one of the most important parts of my strategic edge is that I have a favorite setup. I know exactly what I'm looking for. So when I get into a situation where this was still one of my favorite setups the way it originally set up. I didn't trade it the best, but it's not the setup's fault, it's my fault. And when I got in on the ads, got out near the low, I looked at it and said, man, you just, look at it, the market got you. It happens. And you don't want to revenge trade back in here. I waited for my favorite setup, get back above the 10-day. Now I think that ETH is poised to rally again. We'll see what happens, but like I said, in the NinjaTrader Charting Edge, 1974 is an area I'm looking at. And that brings me to a follow-up tweet that I put up. It came before the other tweet with Dario, but this to me really ties everything together. The impatient pay the patient. I look back at that trade that I did in ETH. I go back my whole year and what I've done in a lot of the markets. I got really aggressive on that last look in ETH because I wasn't patient enough. I could have easily added to my position there, watched the action a little bit, but I was in such a hurry to get into a full position, not wanting to miss that big move, that when it started to roll over, all of a sudden I'm stuck with so many that I had to get out of everything. Now, I got caught in that weeds going, man, what are you doing? Now this time, as it's set up, I will go back to my favorite setup. I was patient, waited for it to prove to me that that was the trade I wanted. And from there now, I'm inching my way in, getting a little smarter with my execution, getting a little smarter with my ads. And I'm going to be more of the patient because the impatient pay the patient. And I know that for me on that losing trade, I definitely paid some of those patient people. Hang tight, I'll be right back with my final thoughts.
24/7 access to diverse global markets. Right here. That's why I added stock index futures to my trading strategy. Now when I see ups and downs coming, I'm ready. Well played.
Final thoughts for today, traders. This tweet really sums it all up. There's no one that can make you a good trader. Only you have the power to do that. Remember, it's not the strategy, it's the executor of the strategy. That's where the real edge lies. Now remember, everybody, July 12th, micro crude oil futures are coming to CME Group. I just did a podcast with Derek Salmon on Futures Radio Show about everything traders need to know about micro crude oil. So you can go and check that out. But if you want to learn more in the meantime, go to activetrader.cmegroup.com. If you're enjoying the show, click that subscribe button. If you have any questions or comments, please put them down below. You can also DM me on Twitter at Anthony Crudele. Don't forget to check out Instagram, Anthony C. Crudele. That's a wrap for today. Happy 4th of July weekend, everybody. See you next week.